And good morning to all of you. My name is Frank, and I'm going to talk to you about a few things. And first is, I've given the name of this talk, Education, a Distant Mirror. Does anyone know the reference, a distant mirror? It's just a bit of trivia. Anyone ever hear of a Barbara Tuchman? Well, I'm an historian, and Barbara Tuchman was one of the great historians of the 20th century. And in the 1970s, she wrote a book called A Distant Mirror, The Calamitous 14th Century. And her point was the problems that the world faced in the 14th century, ongoing war, the Black Death, political instability, was a reflection of the 20th century world. It's a very interesting thought. We have in humanity are pattern thinkers. You know that, right? We are pattern thinkers. We think in patterns. I guess those of you who teach math would know that. And that's why we tend to lead ourselves to dogmatic thought, because dogmas fit into patterns. That's just how humans are. It isn't necessarily the truth of the universe, but it's the truth of our existence. And what that often means, like Nietzsche would say, is the eternal return, is that things often reinvent themselves. One thinks of Lampedusa's famous comment from Il Gatto Leopardo, the great the novel that discusses the collapse of the Kingdom of Naples, and where the young prince speaks to the old prince, and he says, things have to change so that they can remain the same. And while that might be a very cynical way of thinking, in a reality, that is often how humanity is. However, there are times when there are actual changes. Humanity does go through periodical changes. There's a lot of talk about 21st century skills and all kinds of things like this. I am by profession an historian, which means I can predict the past. But predicting the future is a little bit more difficult. I know a lot of people like to do it, but I'll give you a little secret about the world. History moves forward. Hegel said that, the force of history. But what you don't realize is that while history moves forward, it moves forward while looking backward. We only know what we've known. We don't know what we don't know. And we go into the future with the mindset of the past. And those of you who are educators, you realize that when you have a parent come to talk to you and they have a career option for their child that would be beautiful if it was 1955, but may not be the best career for 2030 or 2040 when these kids will actually be entering the workforce, because there are some changes. But we look at education, and education historically has gone through many, many stages. We went through this industrial age, mechanical education, where education became set to the standard curriculums, and it became then eventually the exam barrage took place, and now we're all tied to exam and exam results, and everyone's saying how bad that is, but no matter how much we say how bad it is, we continue to do it, and we will continue to do it for some time. But that will have to change, actually, and in that change, and this is what I'm saying, it's a distant mirror. We go back a bit in history. Have you ever heard of a person named Pitt the Younger? Pitt the Younger? Yeah, not Pitt the Older, that was his daddy, right? Pitt the Younger was a prime minister of Great Britain under George III of the 1780s, 1790s, okay? But here's the amazing thing. He was 22 years old when he became prime minister. He's the youngest person to be prime minister. He was also one of the most successful prime ministers. And I read a book about him, and it basically said the reason that Pitt the Younger was so successful was because of his education. He was homeschooled, as were the nobility and upper middle class people were at that time. Now, what does homeschooled mean? It doesn't mean what it means for us today. Homeschool, and that's how ancient Rome and ancient Greece, were educated. Even ancient India with the Guru Kama, that's actually how it would happen. You'd get a group of students together, usually from a family member, and usually brought one teacher, and that one teacher taught everything. So what happened is true metacognition happened. The students were learning a bit of maths, a lot of literature, because it's very based on humanities. They were learning a lot of literature and language and poetry and history and some basic math and some basic science. But they were basically learning it from one person or two people, which may sound to you, well, that's not really very effective. But what it was is it caused the learner to blend together all the different strands of knowledge, which meant when you came out of his education system, you could problem solve, because you realize that math and literary interpretation and how language functions and how math functions actually have similarities. You get to understand, you've got to decode that pattern. Unfortunately, if William Pitt the Younger would have been born in the 20th century, schools would have knocked that out of him immediately. And he would, if he ever became prime minister, he would be when he was 67 years old or something like that. So what's that have to do with the future? Well, let's look at the future. When we look at where education's going, we hear a lot of talk about we have to bring in metacognition. If you're at IB school, especially in the primary years, the PYP, inquiry-based learning. You didn't hear all those wonderful expressions. What does inquiry-based learning mean? What does inquiry-based learning mean? Anybody know? What does it actually mean?
Ask questions.
Yeah, you ask questions, but isn't that, you always did, didn't Socrates do that, you know? But you base the education around understanding knowledge and maybe even leading somewhere in the best of worlds. And I've worked in many schools in which, you know, inquiry-based learning becomes something mechanical. Also, they download from the internet and they try to put it in the little patterns called unit plans and things like that. I'm not saying we shouldn't do unit plans. Okay, I'm not that much of an iconoclast. But as we move toward this, let's look at when you get into secondary education. You come across the exams. Now, the exams are very important, so I'm not going to say they're not. However, technology is combating the reality of an exam. Now the IB is saying you can't bring any type of a watch into an exam because of that. Well, I got news for you. In a few years, they're going to invent a contact lens that you're going to put in your eye that's going to be attached to some bloody computer somewhere, so the kid could be sitting down with the exam and the computer's going to give him all the answers. Okay? So at what point then do we realize that the realities of these exams can't hold up? They could be easily counterfeited, okay? So then what happens? Well, what's happening and starting to happen, you see it in Finland, you see it in parts of Germany, you see it in parts of Europe, and you see them talking about it here in India, in some very, very special, a lot of schools in Australia. You move toward what's called project-based assessment. Now, when you start to move towards something like that, and that may seem all new, but what you're actually doing is going back to that traditional type of education. Now, I don't want to sound, like people I didn't live in the 2nd century BC in Alexandria, really, so I don't really know how smart they really were, okay? Except, wow, there seem to be a lot of smart folks doing things at really young ages. And that was because this education systems that they had did that to promote people to be somewhat effective. And the universities, and if you look at the early universities, even today, if you look at universities on the continent in Europe, many of them have oral exams. I lived in Norway for many years. I lived in Finland for many years. And oral exams were actually, if you did your I guess you call it your 6th form, right? You call it videregående in Norway. You could actually opt to do oral exams instead of a written exam. And if you do the written exam, it's an interactive exam on a computer anyway. And these strategies are going to have to be utilized and found a way to find its way among all of us, because technology is going to make that traditional type of exam difficult to implement, the traditional type of exam. And that's why I say it's a distant era, because it actually reflects how education would have run for most of human history until the industrial age came, and until we tried to educate everyone. When you have to realize this system I'm talking about was an education for the elites, and as we all know that in the world, let's face it, anywhere in the world, education is a 2- or 3-tiered system. There are the schools for the elites and there's the schools for everyone else. That's unfortunately the reality of the world, and has been for a very long time and will be into the future, okay? We have not yet got to that socialist utopia, which I don't think we ever will get into, to be honest. But the education, as it develops, and as we try to make it realistic for ourselves, and we try to make it meaningful for our students, as we always say, has to take this into account. Now, I've been teaching since the 1980s. Some of you in this room may not even been born then. And, all the teachers in my school, I could have been their kindergarten teacher, certainly some of them. The rest, I could have been their high school teacher. And when I first started to teach, technology was a photocopy machine. you know, or the overhead projector with the plastic on it. Remember those? Anybody old enough? And it used to be one on the floor, and you'd have to sign it out. And Friday, third period, I get the projector, you know, and I thought I was like, so wow. And now I walk into classrooms and I do observations for teachers, and I think I've walked into a movie theater. And I don't want to, I mean, we all use technology, and it's not, you can't not use technology, I would say. It's very useful. But one of the problems that I'm seeing with current education, for all the education speak and all the 21st century skills, all that lovely, wonderful, you know, pedagogical education speak we like to throw out to make ourselves sound intelligent, we are actually currently at the brink of possibly creating a series of passive learners, which means that we could really very negatively affect our future. But I don't think that will happen, because I think technology is going to a point where we will have to think out of the box. The kids are our students are thinking out of the box. And going back to my own experience, having taught since the 1980s, and I've taught, I guess, 3 generations? I don't know how long that would be. So 40 years teaching, so maybe it's 3 generations, 2, I don't know, what's generation, 10 years or 20 years? So you've seen how young people change. One thing I've noticed when I was a younger teacher, students were much more focused to what was going on. If you had a hierarchical class, they took notes. Remember that? You know. Now kids are, oh, I'll download the PowerPoint. You know. So I tell my kids, well, that's going to be really hard because there ain't no PowerPoint for you to download. So good luck to that one. Okay. But we have to realize that. We also have to realize that young people today, and I'm not saying this to criticize the technology, so please, I'm not on some hype thing like that, okay? But their attention level has been affected by things like YouTube. Everything has to be a video and everything has to be 4 minutes, right? I'm very fond of science fiction, and if you are interested in sci-fi, if you're interested in Star Wars, there's a theory among sci-fi aficionados that in the Star Wars universe, they don't know how to read because they never read anything. They're always talking to a computer or a robot that's always talking back to them. They never actually read. So there were some theories going around that is, in the Star Wars universe, none of them can read. We're not at that point. Look how many students can't do cursive writing. In Europe, it's, you know, in Europe, on the mainland Europe, not in Britain, but in Germany and in Scandinavia, where I've lived for many years, the exams that they do have are done on a computer. They have some computer software, and the kids are in a computer lab, and it works in the type of thing. Many students have been protesting or have been sending petitions to the International Baccalaureate, asking them to have online testing, which, as you know, those of you that know this, the IB claims, they've been claiming for 15 years they're going to move to this. Now that it's in the next 5 years. Yeah, okay, well, I'll worry about that when I say it, but they say they're moving toward it. One of the reasons that they are is not just because it's how the world is going in technology. One of the protests that have come out from some of these students in Europe is that because they don't write any longer, having them sit an exam with a pen and have to write is difficult and hampers their ability to think. I'm not saying I agree with it at all. I'm simply telling you, you know that. And sometimes it makes me think that as we move into the future, there are some aspects of the human learning system that we also have to realize. It's important that people continue to write. Whether they write on a computer or write with a pen actually is not really that important to me, or anyone actually. But the fact is, I'm not bemoaning that these kids feel they can't think as fast with a pen. I'm simply mentioning that as technology changes, how we deliver things has to change. All right? I'll go back a few things. I'm old enough to remember when computers first came into schools, and they used to be locked up in a room with heavy gates, like the tomb of a pharaoh or something, you know, and only one person had the key, and only the computer teacher could be in the room because, you know, only the computer teacher knew the secret of how to use the computers. And they were great big things, Apple IIe's and all that, you know, with little tiny green screens. And then the schools started to put computers in classrooms for teachers to use, or in teachers' rooms. It depends, how the school gives teachers their own classrooms or their own offices or all. And then they started to come out with word processing. I remember working in schools in which they would turn off the spell checker because that was cheating. And it would destroy our capacity to think and read. This is for the teachers. And I remember working in schools, why are all the spell checks? Oh, we don't turn them on. That's wrong. Then I would think back, because I'm also old enough to remember calculators. Remember when I went to school, math, calculator, you would need a truck to take it in anyway, but, or you had those, those adding machines where you would, I remember those with paper on it. So you didn't have to worry about that. But when calculators were first being used in schools, and they, you must know this, or your math, you must know this, it's going to destroy math. We're never going to, our entire knowledge of math is going to be destroyed. The next generation, well, that generation grew up and got, Nobel Prizes in physics. They're pretty damn good at math. The calculators did actually not destroy our ability to understand math. And the spell checkers did not destroy our ability to write. Now we're facing AI, right? And has anyone used that? Those AI things that they write? I actually haven't. You have that Turnitin stuff, and it can tell you if the kids have used it. A friend of mine who is another history teacher, he came up with, he had the AI create essays on history topics, and then gave it to the students to mark. And with a mark scheme, of course. And the students gave it really low marks because it was well written, but it was all one-sided. Because it was going on the internet and it was gathering information. And as we know, let's face it, the internet is part of the Anglo Mafia, right? I mean, it's an American British point of view. So, if you're going to research an historical topic, say origin of World War I, the point of view you're going to get, if you have AI do it, So it was good that kids would be, I haven't done that with my class yet. I'm thinking of doing it. And so a lot of people, are concerned. Now the IB has said you can use AI, you just have to cite it. I don't actually know how that actually works in theory. But do you think we're going to stop AI? Like we stopped the spell checker, like we stopped the calculator, like we'll stop the contact lens with the computer in your eye, which I do hope I never live to see, okay? But we can't stop that. But what we will do is, I think, not reinvent, we'd have to develop, and education will have to reflect these kinds of changes. And that's where I go back to a distant mirror. I believe that actually, not tomorrow and certainly not next year, and I'm not even sure 10 years from now, but those of you who have kids who are in kindergarten, first grade, that they might live to see what I'm sort of talking about. When they get into the sixth form, they get into senior high school and into university, you will see a much more dynamic, interactive types of curriculums in which students are, the true inquiry-based, sort of metacognitive kind of lesson planning becomes the norm, in which students are able to sort of set their own ways and almost set their own goals for what they want to learn. We're going to stumble a lot in this process, but I think when it's over, I actually think there could be a future sometime at the end of the 21st century where we can turn out, Pitt the Youngers again. We can actually turn out 22-year-olds who really would be ready, not this generation of 22-year-olds, but some future generation, if you believe in that hope. But la speranza che delude sempre, we say in Italian, hope always leads to disillusion. So it's all what we do with it, because we're humans. And we are by nature competitive. And competition is why we have wars. You know that, right? That's why there's wars, because we're competitive. If we weren't competitive, we wouldn't have wars. Right? And guess what? We're going to continue to have wars. So because another thing that has to be realized is relativism is not actually true. Relativism means that what's happening today is so different, and we are so different from everyone else. Actually, our brains are the same brains of the ancient humans who came out of caves. Our brains are the same. Our capacity to understand and use knowledge is the same as any person of the first century of the Common Era. We have not changed. Our technology has changed. Our dogmas change. Our acceptance of each other changes, and that's all good. I think we live in a relatively better world today in that sense. Not everywhere. We have a lot of problems. We always have problems in this world, so nothing's new about that. But we have not actually changed. What makes us happy, what makes us sad, our need for love, our need for companionship, our need for creature comforts, that has never changed. It's never changed. And we are not evolved beyond that. If we ever evolve beyond that, as evolution, those of you who are biologists would know, you're talking another million years. So education in the future will be something new so that things can stay the same, so that we can prepare people for a future. Another thing that's going to happen, this is sociological, is the nature of work. I would predict that in 50 years, a medical doctor would not be a high-earning profession because computers will do it and do it better. But nursing will be a very high-earning potential because computers cannot wipe your butt. Excuse my language, but they can't do that. And a lot of research that we do will be done by quantum computers. We won't need to torture monkeys any longer because quantum computers can create, virtual labs and things like that. And so young people today, even the kids today who are in your 12th grade who will be going into university next year, I will guarantee that they'll probably have most of them will have two to three different careers. While my generation, maybe you had two. My father's generation, you had one. In my father's generation, you did one thing and you did it for 40 years. I've been a teacher for almost 40 years, so I'm old-fashioned like that. But that's because of changing dynamics and a changing world. We face climate change. We face political instabilities. Well, we always have political instabilities. I got news for you. We've also had climate change also. Okay, climate change probably created the French Revolution. Climate change destroyed the Mayans. Climate change affected North Africa. And so that's actually quite true. So humans, we've had to deal with all these kind of problems before. But one thing about our species is we may be pattern thinkers. We may even be competitive and selfish by nature, but we're also very clever. And we learn to use the things to create something new. But we can't use we can't use knowledge to create something new or to create solutions if we continue in education to put people in little boxes. Now, of course, because I'm an historian, and I'm prejudiced, I think history is the mother of all knowledge, because history requires interpretation. Oh, so does science. Yes, but science only requires interpretations of the facts, of the results, of the scientific process. But history, you're dealing with humanity, and you can't always predict how people are going to respond to something. So like literature, you can have 20 different variations or causes of something. So you really have to think beyond any kind of a box. And one of the great things that's happening today is, at least in my subject, history, is that historians today are more aware of it. Recently, I read a book by Christopher Clark. Do you know who Christopher Clark is? Anyone? No? Christopher Clark is Australian. He is an Australian historian of German history. He's at Oxford. He's an Oxford Don. He's probably, by my point of view, in the English-speaking world, he's probably one of the best historians of Germany. His expertise is 19th, early 20th century German history. And he recently wrote a book called Revolutionary Spring, which is the story of the 1848 revolution. So why is he talking about the 1848 revolution? Because I will tell you why. In this book, and I've read tons of books about this, it's not some political story. The Kaiser left Schönbrunn Palace and the King of Prussia and all that. It is the story of the different peoples, but more so, he talks at great length about early feminism and people like Émile Dastin, who identified the problem isn't monarchies and kings. The problem are the fathers and the brothers. It is the patriarchy of the family that is creating the disequality of society. And until you can break that, you'll never have equality. I didn't even realize that people were saying that in the 1830s. And then talks about how the terrible treatment of the African slaves and how people were talking for liberty except for the African slaves. It brings forth that sort of diversity of understanding. That's one of the benefits we have today. We reinvent how we do this knowledge to be more embracive. Because one of the benefits of our society in the future is, I won't say we're becoming more equal, but there's a lot of disequality. But we're becoming more equal, and we're moving into an historical stage where that equality, be it among races, among economic groups, among genders, or those who don't identify as a gender, is becoming an aspect. It's always been there, but now we identify that. We realize that we cannot understand the human experience if we only see that experience through the traditional eyes of a patriarchy. And that also finds itself in education and how we develop our education and how we look into things. So a wonderful article about women in chemistry. I'm not a science teacher, but you know that's another thing that's been dominated by men for so long, and how we acknowledge and understand different interpretations and develop it. So what I'm trying to say is that the future of education will, in some ways, be a distant mirror to a past in which education was bent on problem solving and with a strong focus on actually language. The German philosopher, I guess he's a British Austrian philosopher, Ludwig von Wittgenstein, who was a professor of philosophy at Oxford up until the 50s. And his theory was language is understanding and knowledge. If it cannot be said, it cannot exist. Nothing can exist that cannot be explained. You can't whistle it, language becomes the most important. So according to Wittgenstein, a deep understanding of language and linguistics and vocabulary would lead to greater understandings of things. And so in that traditional education, that was very much founded on that. In Europe, they would know their Greek and Latin, and of course, in Europe, in France, teaching Latin is an intricate part of the curriculum because it helps promote vocabulary. Especially if you're French speakers, you would know what I mean. English speaking, how many percentage of our words come from Latin? But when you get to Italian or France, you're talking almost all the words are coming from Latin. Even German, how many words? God, the grammar comes from Latin, which is why German grammar is so incredibly difficult. It's even more difficult than Latin, actually. So our traditional education, even though it was an elitist education, prepared people to be thinkers. Now, I believe the future will hold the same because our traditional style of education is not going to survive the tsunami of technology, of AI, when I say technology, the artificial intelligence, and also the tsunami of we must have a deeper and a wider understanding of things in a wider context, not just in the context of, I hate to say that, of a ruling class. I don't mean to sound like a Trotskyite because I'm not. But these are other ways of the future, if we can survive into the future. And I think we will. We're going to have a lot of problems with climate change and all that, or our children will. I may not live to see all that. But we humans have had horrible things before. We found a way around them. I think we'll find ways around this. We are clever people. We're clever when we put our minds to it. But if we don't ensure that our young people can problem solve, if we tie them to bound curriculums and tie them to an educational Raj, that again, an exam Raj, that would be wonderful if they were going to live in 1947 or 1922. We'll have a problem, but we don't have to worry about that because by nature these things will change. Technology is going to cause lots of changes. I have students now that will question knowledge in different kinds of ways than they would have 30 and 40 years ago. The good thing is sometimes those kids will use you to actually learn something. You actually can sometimes learn something if you search the internet. You'd be surprised. And they'll say, "But sir, I read that blah blah." Oh, all right. Oh, wow. Okay, we're gonna have a debate now because you're coming up with different points of view about that. Of course, though, the downside is false knowledge, fake news. And by the way, that's not new. The Aeneid, the Iliad, that's all fake news. Okay? You really think there's a Trojan horse, and you really think that Achilles with the heel and throwing spears and knocking through 5 people? You really believe that happened? You believe the Trojans stole some Greek princess named Helen and they were so mean? You really, that is, after all, the victors writing history, or the Aeneid, that it was the gods' will that the Romans take the world. You know, I mean, we have been weaponizing history. It's, you know, from Pharaoh Ramesses II's misrepresentation of his battles. You know, the Battle of Kadesh, which was an incredible defeat for Egypt, but you wouldn't know that if you saw his wall art and sculpture and carvings at the Temple of Karnak, which shows it as an incredible victory, but actually wasn't. So we've been weaponizing history for a long time. So we will always, you know, we have to be aware of that. We're having the same problem now. Of course, because of the internet, that knowledge gets spread far and wide, but it always did before. I mean, education to some extent is a bit of propaganda, isn't it? Isn't it? We used to call it civics. Raise people to be good citizens. I mean, I don't really continue to sound cynical, but, you know, that does seem, you know, what is a good citizen? What would be a good citizen in Ming China? What does that mean? I've been following the imperial dictates. What's a good citizen in the Habsburg Empire? Being the subject of his imperial and royal majesty. So, you know, what's a good citizen? You know, so we have to realize that we as humans will propagate knowledge, and sometimes we will have false knowledge. I mean, I'm an American, and, you know, my history is full of myths, and we only have 200 years of it. The Alamo, you ever hear the story of the Alamo? That is complete falsehood. It's absurd falsehood, okay? You know? And there's so much talk, you know, I mean, I'm sorry, I'm going to go on another, please excuse me, but there's so much talk about, you know, the terror of war and bombing and hurting civilians, and that's true, you know, that's true. But I raised my hand, well, dear Germans and Americans and Russians, how did you win World War II? When you terror bombed Dresden and burned that beautiful city to the ground and incinerated 85,000 women and children and old men, was that okay? Because you gave those people medals and built statues to those people, which you still have an honor. So another aspect, again, of the fake news is that also relativism, you know. Well, that was then, you know, that was actually my father's lifetime. That wasn't then. You know, then would have been 300,000. I mean, you know, dinosaurs was then. That I would definitely say is a different Weltanschauung. There was a different world going on there. So we are imperfect species. I know that, and we are still intelligent. And the future of education is going to have to move toward more student-based and metacognitive and joining the curriculums, and has to also be history. When you teach history, at least, you know, Stalin is Stalin, those events, we may be more wise now and look at the role of women or the role of climate and all that. But science, which is also the new dogma, that's the new dogma. Science says, you know. Well, you know, when I was a kid, science said a lot of things it no longer says. So, you know. But science in the Middle Ages said you should believe people. That was, you know, because that was good science in the Middle Ages. So, you know. So. But as those of you who are scientists know, especially astronomers, you know, we're discovering new things all the time. So the nature of science isn't that there are divine truths. The nature of science is that there are very good systems that you use to understand something, and the understanding that facts are based on what we know now, but our knowledge might have to change, right? You know, even things that Einstein said, people are saying, well, actually, that's not really true. It's bigger than that. And so the education of our young scientists and mathematicians has to be for them to be able to explore that, to be able to see the multiple interpretations, or to be able, as technology allows us greater discoveries. And quantum computers, which we don't really have now, but quantum computers in terms of research will really revolutionize. I am sure that we'll find cures for cancers and things, and, you know, through the use of technology. But our ability to be able to develop that, to use that knowledge, and to develop with it will be very important. And education will be forced to do that. You won't be a successful scientist if you're going to say, this is how it's done and it doesn't change. That will not make you a successful scientist at all in the future. And our ability to read, how we interpret, how we view literature is also going to change. I mean, film's the new literature, right? Film is absolutely the new literature. It has been maybe for the last century, but it really is. And we can't stop these things, but they will be integrated. And I believe this will happen through a natural process. I don't believe you're going to have some educational guru who's going to stand up and make a whole bunch of changes. And it's not going to happen hierarchical. It's actually going to happen from the ground up. But we'll make a lot of mistakes in the process. We're going to stumble a lot, like we always do. But that's what happens with society. We are at a point of change in humanity. That is true. That is true. But we will find a way to make it the way it was. We will find a way to change so that things can be the same. Make education the same means to prepare people for a future. And that will happen. But the way we do that may have to change from the way we are doing things now, and certainly from the way I was educated. I went through Catholic schools in the 1950s. I'm sorry, in the 1960s and 70s. I was born in the 50s. I went to Catholic school in the 60s and 70s, in really what is a Byzantine world, a world that's long since gone. Schools are no longer like that. And I'm happy for that education, because at least I got a good rounding in literature and history. I thought it was history at the time. I now realize that wasn't all the true story history. And so I have great faith that humanity will develop education systems that meet those needs. But those systems will have to take into consideration the fact that knowledge can be transient. We have some fears. One fear is the massive growth of fake news or fake knowledge. But again, we've always had that. Empires are built on fake news, on fake knowledge. So that's nothing new. You're very foolish to think that, oh, that's just Fox News. And that's been going on, since carvings from ancient Egypt. We've always weaponized information and tried to put it in a certain way. But if young people can develop metacognitive thought, and they can develop ways to understand how you research or how to check knowledge, then that can be combated. Except, of course, like Hegel said in his Ideas of the Theory of History, most people want a simple and easy life. They don't want to be kings or emperors. They actually don't. They want to have a house. They want to eat. They want to watch TV. They want to get married. They want to make love. They want to go to the beach once a week, once a year. That's all they want. But unfortunately, history, as Hegel said, was a great force, that force of development and change. And it smashes over people like a train. So most people are the victims of history, right? The atrocity of African slavery in the United States, the patriarchy. These things are, the victims of history. And Hegel said the great person is not the person who's conducting that engine, but the person who can jump on the engine and for a period of time take control of it. The person who can understand, where that goes. And that will probably always happen. Let us just hope that it doesn't happen in a way that closes the human mind, but in a way that can open more minds. And I think we see that. I think there are more open minds now than there would have been when I was a young man or a young teacher. And I don't fear IT or I don't fear technology in teaching, although I make my students write notes because they actually remember more when they write. You'd be surprised they do, But we're in India. Luckily in India, our kids know how to write. All my students are Indian nationals, so my kids all know how to write. There's no problem there. They even have cursive writing. There's no problem at all there. So, because the culture here is, of course, to take the exams and take the tests. So that could be beneficial for the time being. But that's changing also. And as educators, we'll have to find ways to change with it. But, like I say, the distant mirror, things change to stay the same. Our species, and one more thing. For most of human history, I don't know how long our species has been on Earth, biologists, 180,000, 200,000 years. For 95% of that time, life expectancy was about 30 or 40 years. You know what that means? That means the great strides in the human experience, the first cities, the first farming communities, the first religions, the first literature, the first armies, the first economy, were created by people who were probably between the ages of 16 and 30. Never underestimate what young people can do. And that, of course, our prehistoric ancestors probably understood very much how knowledge has to be interacted, because that's how you survived in the wild, 200,000 years ago. And this is also part of our DNA. And this will continue, I believe, very strongly. It will continue, and it will continue to affect how we develop education. I know I've been speaking in deep philosophical trends. I'm sorry. I've thrown a lot of fancy names and philosophies out to you, as opposed to a bunch of pedagogical nonsense. But the thing is, I actually do have hope for this future. And I do believe we will see an education in which we integrate technology to develop students that will be will be more productive for society, who will be able to bring different forms of knowledge together. Hopefully this will be done for the good, but education, we all say education is important, but I'm going to say another thing from history, okay? Some of the most educated people in the world have not been very nice. Dr. Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister of the Third Reich, was a brilliant man, very intelligent. He really was. You read his work, beautiful. His German was perfect. He had a PhD when he was 20-something. Absolutely brilliant. Heinrich Himmler also was a brilliant man. I wouldn't call them nice. Joseph Digashvili, who you know is Stalin, he killed 35 million of his own people. A brilliant man, wrote poetry. And if you ever read his poetry, it's quite beautiful. Mao Zedong wrote poetry. I mean, you could sit down and have a conversation with Mao Zedong about poetry, art, humanity, and you walk away, this man is brilliant. And he was. But that doesn't always mean they're good or nice. Or maybe they created something. One can say, maybe Mr. Stalin, he created the Soviet Union. Mao created an independent, non-imperialist China, and then that's good. But at the same time, bad things happen. So one thing we can't lose track of is the sense of moral responsibility and the use of knowledge, because knowledge can be used in a very, very negative way. Knowledge by itself is all, intelligence and heart, it's all very good. But again, those of you who have seen that film Oppenheimer, which I've not seen, but I know enough about Oppenheimer and, a brilliant man and all that. And, the creation of atomic weaponry, there's a lot of great things about it, but the potential, the horror potential of it. But that's aspects, again, of humanity, how knowledge can be used sometimes in a very bad way. It could even be, done. I mean, they say that the road to hell is paved by good intentions. Sometimes in trying to do something good, we can lose touch of something bad if we become too elitist with our knowledge and that. So I've ranted too long for you. I'm really sorry I've ranted with tons of history and philosophy. But just reflect on this. Reflect on the human experience. Reflect on the development of education, okay? And remember, it's a distant mirror. Our future will be like our past, and that can be a good thing, because there were some good benefits of past education systems, okay? The Rukama here in India is a perfect example of it. And these things can happen, and as these things develop, we can't fear technology because it's there. It's there, I'm sure when people started to write on paper instead of papyrus, someone thought that was going to be the end of writing, or we're not making bronze tablets anymore, so that's bad. We're never going to be able to remember literature or something. But those changes are just part of our development. So for those of you who are educators, do reflect. Those of you who are parents, think. And the world your children will live in will be the same but different. And that distant mirror. If you ever get a chance to read Barbara Tuchman's book, The Distant Mirror, it's even though it was written in the 70s, it's quite a brilliant book, actually. Okay, so thank you all very much for your patience. Thank you so much. Okay, Mr. Howard.
Thank you very much, Frank. That was amazing. And can I say, I really like somebody who can quote Hegel. Well done. Thank you. So there are a couple of other events happening at the moment. A workshop has just started on floor 1. And on floor 4, if we all rush to the elevator, which there is a talk on metacognition followed by a panel, which I think ties beautifully in to what Frank was talking about. So please make your way up to the 4th floor or the 1st floor and enjoy. Thank you, everybody.